ACS Cyber panel this morning. Before I'd like to start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Readiness Nation, and pay my respects to elders, past and present. We have a number of very distinguished guests here today. I'd first like to welcome Alastair MacGibbon, Special Advisor to the Prime Minister on Cybersecurity. Alastair will be addressing us shortly. I'd also like to welcome David Shearer, CEO of ACS Square, and Matt Lobb, CEO of Osaka, two highly respected organizations that enjoy global adoption of the certification program in cyber-related areas. Also, a special welcome to Professor Jill Slay, who for the past 12 months have been working and heading our cybersecurity task force. I'm very excited to share this week with you that Professor Jill has agreed to join ACS and be joining ACS to work on our cyber and building the ecosystem in Australia with the ACS. So welcome to ACS, Jill. ACS has a long-established commitment to cybersecurity. Even before I joined ACS many years ago, we've already been involved with cyber. Cyber has been taught in most of our courses, in a component of the ICT courses in universities for a long time. In 2011, ACS responded to the federal government cyber discussion paper, Connecting with Confidence, where we highlighted the need to develop coordination between agencies and industry and the focus on a pipeline of cyber professionals in Australia. ACS is part of a global network of ICT professionals in around the world. Started more than about 60 years ago in Paris by UNESCO, called the International Federation for Information Processing, IFIP for short. Last May, the president of IFIP worked at the European Foresight Cybersecurity meeting, where he advocated that professionalism of the ICT workforce is a key element for building trustworthy and reliable systems, and that it is important to ensure that cybersecurity and cyber resilience is also a duty of care of every individual ICT professional. So to play our part in securing ACS' future, ACS continues to perform the role of trusted advisor to government, deliver services to identify and certify ICT professionals you can trust, including through our professional standards scheme, which is recognized in most states and territories of Australia. To this end, it was a little over 12 months ago that I met with Alastair and discussed the requirements for maturing the cyber security profession in Australia. With the release of the Prime Minister's cybersecurity strategy, the introduction of the mandatory data breach notification legislation, the Commonwealth's commitment through the Australian Cybersecurity Network and Centres of Excellence, we are seeing real change and momentum in this area. Last November, ACS hosted the Ministerial Forum at the Hilton in Sydney, which included a specialised panel on cybersecurity. We also, on that occasion, launched the ACS Cyber Report, Cybersecurity Threat Challenges and Opportunity, which covers a number of issues around cyber. At the panel, with our diverse panel from experts ranging from invited guests from Netherlands, Europe, and Australia, ministers joined with the industry to share their insights and concerns about cybersecurity around the world, and particularly in Australia, and what needs to happen, both locally and internationally, to address these issues and to help grow our cybersecurity capability. There was a consensus amongst the cybersecurity panelists that cybersecurity is a multidisciplinary matter. It is a business issue. It is just not just a technology matter, and that we all have a very important role in lifting cyber resilience. So as part of ACS' commitment to educate the broader society and economy in this area, and to a highlight guide has been produced, which is on your seat and on your table today, which was circulated as part of an insert in the Australian Financial Review. This report included highlighting that cybercrime is already the leading financial crime in Australia, with the average cost of an attack to an Australian business ranging from $400,000 to, which is a significant increase from $276,000 just 2 years previously. And this can increase to $1 million per business if not managed effectively. Despite this guide also revealed that only 6% of C-level executives consider cyber to be a critical issue, which is a highly concerning statistics. So in May this year, the ACS released the third of our Australians Digital Pulse report. It highlighted the significance of the digital economy to Australia. And now, with the digital boom, with Australia's export in services increasing by 12% to a value of $2.8 billion. So overall, digital technologies are tipped to be worth $139 billion to the Australian economy in 2020, which will equate to 7% of GDP. So in light of the recent and the numerous cyber attacks we have recently, WannaCry, Petya ransomware attacks around the world, I want to make a special point that a world-leading cyber security ecosystem has the potential to expedite continued economic growth. Of course, the professional group for those working in ICT, the ACS, is doing our bit by providing cybersecurity professional development, accrediting educational courses, and operating our own certified professional program, which we'll be launching with the Minister of Cyber tomorrow in Canberra. By requiring our members to comply with the highest standards of ethics and professionalism, we are also helping to drive quality outcomes in this very critical area. To this end, Jill has been heading, as I mentioned, our cybersecurity task force over the last 12 months, looking at various areas including job roles and occupation in the cyber area, establishing a baseline of knowledge and skills which could represent the minimum expectation of cybersecurity technicians and professionals in Australia, and ensuring recommendations are aligned with international best practice and comply with appropriate national and international cybersecurity professional and technical standards. In formulating this benchmark, existing frameworks in the UK and the US were reviewed, such as those by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Earlier this year, I was very fortunate to be invited to join the Australian Trade Mission on Cyber to San Francisco with the ACS CEO Andrew Johnson and Professor Jill Slay. And it's there that we signed the Memorandums of Understanding with both ICS Square and ISACA, as evidenced by our joint commitment to share objectives, particularly to facilitate the strong recognition of skilled ICT professional workforce as a key driver for national productivity, innovation, and well-being, and to improve the quality of our ICT education and training. So I'm very pleased today to have ICS Square and ISACA joining us, and we'll be going around 2 other cities in the next day, Canberra and Melbourne, to talk about building Australians' capability as a front line for cyber defense. So thank you to our ACS members, our distinguished guests, our invitees who have joined with us today and shown your interest in helping to build cyber ecosystem in Australia. So now it's my very pleasure to invite Alastair MacGibbon to the stage. Thank you.
Many thanks, Anthony. I greatly appreciate the invitation to be here today. Just made it, in fact. I took the risk of flying in from Canberra this morning. It was a joyously bumpy flight, so haven't eaten breakfast, so save some for me later. But look, thank you very much for having me. It is a great pleasure, and these are a great gathering of three fantastic organisations, the ACS, ISC Squared and ISACA. So let me start by saying that for this year, 2017, I've been saying 2017 is the year for us to make a dramatic difference in terms of cybersecurity. Not just because it's 2017 and we should always try to make a difference, but because there is a palpable shift in the conversations that I have as I travel around this country, and I'm sure it's the same for many of you as well. But the story starts in April last year with the launch of the cybersecurity strategy by the Prime Minister, a strategy that is funded, a rare thing, of course, in a fiscally constrained world, an ambitious strategy with 33 initiatives that essentially covers some really key areas. You'd imagine with any cybersecurity strategy, of course, the number one objective is we increase the cybersecurity skills of the Commonwealth, the people that, as I say, staff the wall to protect not just government agencies, but of course the economy more broadly. But I've said in the 15 or so months since I've been in this role that if all you do is add staff to the wall, it's a game you're going to lose. We have a defender's dilemma, of course, you all know this, and the strategy would be a failure. The strategy then also calls for increased information sharing and cooperation between the government and the private sector. To that end, we've launched the first of the joint cyber centres in Brisbane. We'll soon open one in Melbourne, shortly thereafter in Sydney, Perth and then Adelaide. So we're doing that. And of course we can always improve the amount of information we share between government and corporates. But again, if all we did was add staff to the wall from a government perspective, and then if all we did is share some more information, again, this would be a losing game. The magic in the strategy that was launched by the Prime Minister really then comes down to the last three main areas of focus. The first is our international push, and that's very important because, of course, we all know this is a global thing, and the more we push the norms that Australia believes in on the internet, the concept of the rule of law, the concept of behaviours by nation states, the concept that there should be no safe haven for criminals, helps make a more safe and secure internet and connected devices that we use in this country. And to that end, the first cyber ambassador was appointed in the form of Dr. Toby Feakin, who's doing a remarkable job taking Australia's interests offshore, and a very important part of the strategy. But I think perhaps the most exciting things launched by the Prime Minister was this concept of improving the skills base in Australia and developing a cybersecurity industry. And let me focus on those very briefly. In fact, I'll focus clearly more on the skills side given what we're talking about today, but I'll talk about the industry side first. It goes without saying that it makes economic sense for this country, of course, to grow an industry in an area that has such staggering year-on-year growth. Cybersecurity is one of the fastest growing industries in the world, and we need to have our fair share of that economic pie. It also makes really good sense, of course, as we grow the skills and the capabilities in this country, that will have added benefits, of course, to the security and safety of those around us. And the strategy is really more about economic enablement than it is about protection against bad, because protection against bad is a very negative concept, when really what we're looking to do, of course, is to increase the trust and confidence in the fabric of the machines that dominate our society and our economy. And if we can do that, then we grow our economy naturally anyway. So the strategy is a sound one, but it also talks very heavily about the concept of skills. But first I want to say why I think the conversation has shifted. It wasn't just the launch of a strategy. It wasn't just that there are great organisations coming together. There were a few seminal events that have occurred in the past 15 or so months that matter. And Anthony's already mentioned a few of them. The first was in August last year when the census stopped functioning. You may have noticed that on the night. It's a joke that's going to get old at some point, but not for a while. That called into question the very concept of digital service delivery of government and whether people could trust us to gather information, to hold that information securely, to use that information wisely. And it's a really interesting wake-up call. Of course, there were a series of very small denial of service attacks that led the Bureau of Statistics to take the website offline. There was no compromise of the data. The data ended up being very good, and if you've seen the Bureau's output from that census, really good statistical outcomes. But an interesting wake-up call. The next major pivot point, at least from my job's perspective, was in the United States with the now widely recognised attempt by a foreign government to influence the outcome of a democratic election via cyber means. The only thing in dispute is whether or not it actually did impact the outcome of an election, not that there wasn't an attempt by another nation to do so. Again, a really interesting wake-up call. And the third for me was the WannaCry ransomware campaign. We know that ransomware, of course, is one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing crime type. There's nothing new, sadly, about the concept of criminals running large campaigns that lock up the computers of businesses and individuals and the demand for money. We all know that. But the difference between those normal day-to-day events and WannaCry was the impact it had on critical infrastructure, particularly the health system in the UK, and of course a few other systems around the world. There were only 18 reported cases to the Commonwealth, largely small and medium businesses, small businesses, and many of them were able to actually get their businesses back up and running again from backups, which was a great story. Very few were dramatically affected. But again, an interesting wake-up call, a near miss, you could say, as to what impact it could have. And those three things have really changed the political discourse. It's improved, it's increased the amount of pressure on us, which helps improve our service delivery, of course, as public officials. It's also changed the dialogue in boardrooms. Quite a significant shift in the types of conversations that we're having. And those are good things. But a constant conversation we have is this one of skills. It's widely recognised that there's a skills deficit in ICT broadly, but particularly when it comes to cybersecurity, which is why discussions like this and initiatives like those of the ACS, ISC squared and ISACA are so important. So I'll talk a bit more about skills. Our strategy talks about skills, and there is a fund to develop more tertiary education, to identify academic centres of cybersecurity excellence, and the first two of those institutions were selected recently, the University of Melbourne and Edith Cowan in the West, and there'll be more to come. But if all we do is focus on tertiary education institutions, I think we've missed the point. An observation I'd make is that we've had a strong fascination with tertiary education for far too long. And we have good tertiary education institutions, and we will continue to get better when it comes to our cybersecurity education. But we also need to focus on vocational training and indeed those people that are self-taught, because some of the best cybersecurity professionals we meet, of course, have taught themselves, not always doing the right thing, and we need to create avenues for those people to actually come to the side of goodness and light, to protect the communities that they operate in, to harness that amazing intellectual capital to help protect those very systems that we operate on. Which is why initiatives like this this morning and that will be launched tomorrow in Canberra are so important for us, because it tries to make sense of the skills that we have and help to standardise those somewhat. A casual observer would say that there's been an awful lot of conflict, an awful lot of overlap, and often some confusion as to what certifications are best for people to have. So any exercise, Jill, that maps that convoluted and complex world and tells a story as to where someone can go to get their skills recognised so that they can have those skills properly recognised are important. So certifications, vocational training and self-taught people are really important to us in this industry. And in many respects, I'd say to you, until we actually get this supply right of staff, the supply right of skilled people, we're almost seagulls fighting after the same chip. That government will sit there and say that it will grow some skills. The private sector might come, offer more money, better terms and conditions, and steal the chip from us. One big business will fight over that same person with the next, and we have this game of inflationary wages, good for those of you in the cybersecurity business, bad for business generally. And of course, we have the deficit. We have the fact that we just don't have enough people to be doing the work that's there. And as I travel through schools and I meet parents and other people, I say, if you want your child to have a job for life, if you want your child to have a job that's secure, that's relatively safe, white collar, and will draw a good wage and be in demand more than likely for the duration of their time in this very disrupted world, try cybersecurity. And what we also need to do is look, of course, to retread those that are already in IT. If you're already helping run networks, if you're already involved in computers, to look to make a transition into cybersecurity. To look at people in professions that are disrupted and help move them into one that will be less disrupted. So they will be smarter at providing those people that, as I say, will add to the very trust and confidence of the fabric of the machines that dominate our lives, both our social and our economic lives. In fact, our very national security in the true sense of national security. So, as we continue to push more money into this ecosystem through the Australian Cybersecurity Growth Network that was already mentioned by Anthony, through our increased funding for universities through academic centres of cybersecurity excellence, through the concept of increasing Cooperative Research Council grants, through the Defence Science and Technology Group of Defence, through Data 61 with its remarkable linkages into most of the tertiary institutions in this country, working with the ACS, ISC Squared and ISACA to help bring those things together, then we together can actually create that concept of filling that supply chain of staff, creating great employment for our people, helping develop an industry that will add to our economic bottom line, and through its very existence, help improve the security and safety of the other systems that we own and operate as an economy. It's a virtuous thing. And so 2017 is the year for us to really capitalise upon that. I note that I'm now up in time. I broke my watch earlier, but I have my trusty phone here telling me that I'm just at the exact 12-minute mark, Mr. Chair. So with that, I'll say congratulations to ACS, congratulations to ISC Squared, and congratulations to ISACA and your initiative to help bring great skills together. Thanks very much, everyone.
So if I could invite our panellists, Jill Slay, Matt Loeb and David Shearer to the stage. Now, part of this morning is we really want to encourage audience interaction, have plenty of questions here. And might not get too much time. So if you feel the need at any stage, just put up a hand and we'll have one of our AV team bring a microphone over to you. So just to get the juices flowing, we're going to start with some rapid fire responses and to set the scene and context. Ransomware, pay or no pay, and why? David.
Tough question because there's so many different permutations of the types of ransomware, types of attacks. You know, on an individual basis or a healthcare organization that has oversight from regulatory bodies, they can be between a rock and a hard place because law enforcement looks at them as a victim, regulators look at them as maybe somebody that has not done their due diligence in protecting customer information. But if it's a life, limb, and property type of situation, a healthcare body that can no longer serve patients, as we saw in Europe, you know, that's a situation where you might have to pay. But we also see on an individual basis where people can't restore from backup, individuals at home, just average citizens that are having ransomware attacks. So I think it's a really tough question just to put ransomware into one bucket and say, do you pay or not pay? If you're a financial organization, the different types of attack vectors that we see happening there doesn't really make that an easy, straightforward question to answer. So maybe one of our other panelists will give me a better answer than that. But I don't think there's an easy way. Ransomware is going to continue to be a challenge. As we looked initially at healthcare records, the cost of them on an individual basis was going up, 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 and then they started to normalize down. And so the bad actors determined that, well, let me get all of it and go for bigger dollars than individual records. And so criminal activity like that, they're very adaptive and creative. And so I don't think I have a single response for that. And if I go on much longer, I won't give any of my colleagues a chance to answer.
That's okay, keep going, David, because I would just agree with you wholeheartedly. I don't think there's a simple answer to it. And in fact, when you look at the number of ransomware incidences that get reported, it makes me wonder how many are not being reported, because it's simply easier to set it beside. So you have this issue around what is the right thing to do, and I think there are. I think everyone would agree from an ethical standpoint that it's never right to pay, but the realities are that people are involved and having to make decisions with regard to their enterprises, and I think that this will continue to be something that we all wrestle with in terms of trying to determine what the best action is to take in the situation that we're faced with.
My advice would be, following from Alastair's example, would be to make sure you've got good governance and good management, and you keep backing up and don't pay. And if at all possible, that you, and especially because we have so many small to medium enterprises, that you focus on employing somebody or buying a service to manage your cybersecurity, and a whole essential part of that will be the backing up and all the other procedures. So therefore, you're much less vulnerable to the problem.
I mean, I'll just add, if you look at a situation where somebody exfiltrates data that's encrypted from an organization and they're holding you ransom, but they can't use the information and you have the ability to restore, that's a situation where you still have leverage and you wouldn't pay in that situation. But we've seen people pay, and we see cyber insurance now starting to come in to consider ransomware and payouts associated to ransomware. So, I know that the issue is you pay and then they just do it to you again. Well, hopefully if you find the attack vector that they use to exploit you, you fill that hole, and if you did have to make that payout, maybe you've got cyber insurance that helps you offset that cost, and you learn from that, and going forward understand that they're going to come after you again. But perhaps your security posture is improved and you learn from the event.
Matt, when you consider the threat landscape, what are the ones that are keeping you awake at night?
All of them. Honestly, I mean, I think the reality is that the threat landscape is changing daily, and the way I would look at it is simply going back to some of the principles that Jill was talking about, is that number one is you need to have good governance. If you have good governance in place, and that starts to link into are your security teams being not only kept current, but are they also engaging in the professional development, the continuing professional education required to keep track of the changes that are happening so that they can be better prepared to deal with any type of threat or attack that presents itself.
Jill?
I think the thing, I'm speaking as an educator, the thing that has always kept me awake is trying to understand the complexity of the systems that we're dealing with and the complexity of the area that's being called cybersecurity. And understanding what do the bad guys do and how do they do it. What could I, as a researcher, develop? Because I'm a forensic computing person. And what can we develop as solutions to that? What can my PhD students do for that? But also understanding the complexity, and I'm not being nasty, of what the vendors are offering, and trying to understand whether they're developing solutions which actually solve the real problems. And it's almost about having a mind which keeps open to the complexity of the issue and the complexity of the solution.
Thank you. David?
So, not minimizing everything that's out there that we always worry about, it's critical infrastructure. Around the world, whether it's the United States or anywhere else, these tend to be industrial control systems that control critical delivery of utilities, that drive almost everything. So critical infrastructure attacks I was just talking last night, when I was a young man, I was able to watch on black and white television missiles moving towards Cuba, and we looked at weapons of war that we could visibly see and we can understand. Now weapons of war and destruction are lightweight malware code that's burrowed into critical infrastructure. You may not even know it's there. I mean, we see in the threat landscape now a patience. These bad actors are very patient. They'll own you long before you know it, and they'll pull the trigger when the time comes right to do that. And so when you look at that from a nation-state attack type of situation, that's what keeps me up at night. I mean, you wake up in a cold sweat because we're so unprepared globally in that sector, in the industrial control sector, that has so many different permutations for these creative minds, deviant creative minds that look to do people ill will, and so that's just, those are a lot of scary permutations within critical infrastructure and industrial control systems.
David, I'd like to pile on that point. I mean, to simply say that the issues around critical infrastructure are increasingly more complex, not just because of the reasons that David mentioned, but then when you consider the fact that one of the biggest challenges is the equipment itself. You have equipment, industrial control systems, and the related equipment is very expensive. And if you're a public utility, you need support from the regulator community to free up the necessary capital that will allow for the investments in newer equipment that should be a lot more resilient. Because I think the reality is that we look at, we look at resilience of the hardware. I mean, the design, security by design is one of the longer term methods of mitigating a lot of the risks that we see. And the challenge is, how do you actually make those investments to get the improved equipment in place that can help with the efforts to address the risks?
And just a real quick add to that, one of the things that compounds that is that Matt is exactly right. Historically, controllers within industrial control systems, very expensive, proprietary protocols and so forth. Now there are IP-based controllers, much cheaper, lower cost, and so the propensity is out there to connect industrial control networks with the corporate network for a business analytics aspect. There's a lot of good reasons to do that to run your business, but it's a terrible attack vector from jumping from the corporate network into the industrial control side. So the very nature that the IP devices now that are coming in to replace those antiquated proprietary systems open up the whole IP stack as an attack vector coming from your corporate network as a pivot point into the ICS side of your corporation, or a country, from that matter, jumping from corporate networks.
So these are big ticket items, and given it's ever escalating, I will throw to Philip. Can I have a microphone over here?
He has a mic.
We have the mic on, thank you. Philip Argy, past president of the ACS. If I go back 11 years when I was president, even long before that, people will know I was talking about the difference between trusted and trustworthy, and advocating the need for trustworthy people, processes and systems, and that's much broader than cybersecurity. That goes to reliability, it goes to a whole range of issues. But just honing in on the skills issue, one of the difficulties is knowing who you can trust. We talk about trusted individuals, but in fact that's the problem. Trusted individuals who turn out to be not trustworthy. How do you know the difference? And one of the things we advocate for is looking for membership of a professional organisation, looking for people who subscribe to a code of ethics. It's not a guarantee, but it improves the probability that you've got a trustworthy person as distinct from a charlatan who's self-proclaimed expert. Now, we have at the moment in Australia, probably many of them, but there's one person who appears frequently on Channel 9 who is shown as a global expert in cybersecurity who has no qualifications whatsoever. Is a complete shonk. I won't name him. I'll probably get sued for defamation or something. Already been threatened twice. But we can't have that. We can't have that situation. You have a lot of people reliant on individuals like that, and it's a complete false sense of security. So we really do need to establish a protocol which helps people recognise when they've got trustworthy, as distinct from merely trusted, people, processes and systems. So I'd love the panel to address how we can best achieve that.
Can I respond to that? So what we've been doing within the ACS with the Cyber Task Force is considering that issue, because I think that was part of Alastair's sort of requirements in the first place. How do we work out who the trusted cybersecurity professional is? And trustworthy. Okay, so in Australia, the history is that these two organisations have developed members in their different spheres. When I first came into this field, my mentor is one of the founders of ISC², and he told me that I wasn't going to be credible in what was called information security unless I had a certification as well as a PhD. So I feel that forcing a person to go through the rigour of actually what used to be a 6-hour multiple choice test where you had to get 80% to pass, it was probably a good rigour. So and following on from the examples of what the US have done, what the Cyber Task Force has tried to do is to preserve everything that already exists within the Australian Computer Society of professional standards, and to add from these certifications that are represented, translated into severe language, what I would call learning outcomes. So you can say, if you've got MACS, CP, CT, plus these other outcomes, now we have a professional standard which includes cybersecurity. That I think for Australia, that's a simple version of what the Americans have been doing since about 2005. And so for us, I believe that's step one of developing a national standard, because each one of them contains continuing professional education, which also aligns with the ISO standards and aligns with the work of the existing work of the ACS. I actually don't know, I couldn't personally think of any other system, any other way of doing this, because anything which requires a burden of more study, of an Australian kind of examination, which looks like the examinations which already exists, is very costly, very time-consuming, and most people's employees will resist doing that anyway. We don't want to embed that in the academic system per se. We want to sort of infiltrate the academic system from my point of view, but we don't necessarily want to impose all that on the academic system, because we understand that the academic system is full of theoreticians who actually have, I'm sorry, looking at my friends over there, looking at theoreticians who've actually sort of made the disciplines of computer security very theoretical ones, which get into journals, but they're not going to solve your problem with ransomware. So, long answer, but I hope we've begun the journey of dealing with your question.
So I would say ISC² has a code of ethics. We have canons, and we have a board of directors committee that oversees and looks at people that are turned in, if you will, for ethical types of things. We've long since looked at that as these are positions of trust. I know you're saying trustworthy. Maybe we need to change that nomenclature. And even within the United States, it's really tough to have any type of political conversation. But with the new administration's discussion about people coming into the country, we've let the administration know that the H-1B1, the HB1 visa, any changes to improve that should include our members, because they are members that subscribe to a code of ethics. And people that subscribe to that type of behavior and professional conduct should be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. Now, that's just one organization doing it, and ISC² doesn't have the answer to everything. We're not delusional. But we've always looked at that. These positions of trust, ethics, to your point, is extremely important. And we have a very rigorous process, and that committee, that's a very busy committee, because we have peer reviews where any member can turn somebody in for an ethical violation. There are other ways that people can notify us that we might have a member that has violated some code of ethics relative to the canons that we subscribe to. And I agree with you. I think it's vitally important.
And ISOC is exactly the same structure for oversight of our code of professional ethics, and a lot of rigor behind the review of any complaints that come forward with an emphasis on trying to get to the adjudication of those as quickly as possible, given the potential impact of somebody's work in that regard. So again, to the point that you made in your question, I mean, there's no 100% guarantee, but this is a great way of the professional community itself coming together to help police it and keep it strong and on the road of trustworthiness.
Can we take the second question?
Hello. My name's Peter Hind. Given that a good proportion of cybersecurity, consumer-related cybersecurity incidents entails somebody impersonating somebody else, like a bank, impersonating a bank or impersonating a utility company, I want to ask, probably Jill, do you think it's time that we have a serious discussion of when it is appropriate to communicate via email with our customer base and maybe via old snail mail? Because I know through snail mail, nobody's going to cybersecurity me. I see now that the Queensland government wants to issue speeding fines through email. Well, I'll tell you, as a consumer, that would put me in a real quandary. How would I trust the veracity of that email? And what I'm seeing increasingly is the quality of these fraudsters' emails are getting smarter and smarter and smarter. If consumers knew that they would never get an email correspondent from a bank or from a utility company, what would that do to reduce cybersecurity threats?
Interesting question. My instinct is that with my bank, which is one of the big four, they don't actually, if they do communicate by email, they only communicate enough to tell me to go and look inside my NetBank inbox. But I've seen some fantastic scams, some fantastic phishing. Isn't there one that circulated speeding fines? Was it from AFP or New South Wales Police? It's a very authentic one. So I've been on a kind of training course on, with all my experience, a training course on how to recognise phishing, and I've gone super neurotic. But I think what you're getting to the heart of a problem, and it's a problem that is very difficult for us to solve when we're still dealing with a generation who are older people older than ourselves, who are still a bit nervous about this. So I have spoken, for instance, when I lived in Adelaide with the South Australian Police, we gave some talks to the University of the Third Age. But all I did, even though the police had trained me with the vocabulary I could use, I still made people very, very scared. And I got emails coming back asking me so many questions that I realised that somehow, societally, we have to put in some greater level of awareness. There are lots of initiatives doing this, but I agree with you that if we could ask the banks and the utilities to provide some much more secure online portal or some other way of retrieving bills, invoices and messages, that would be a step towards it, yeah.
Did I see a third question down this end?
Robert Samuel from Grant Thornton. In February next year, there are the mandatory data disclosure laws coming in Australia, roughly similar to legislation already in place in the United States and about to be in place in Europe as well. I'm just wondering, we certainly see a low level of awareness amongst our client base of the implications for business for all of that, but I'm just wondering
Mandatory data.
Your perspective on data disclosure having to go public on data breaches and how one responds. The legislation's quite clear. You've got to take a reasonable efforts to protect, and you've got to take reasonable efforts to inform. And in the States, that's led to 4 and 5 year legal disputes that have cost millions of dollars. Just wondering what the panel's view is on the implications for cybersecurity training on this broader data breach and, I guess, data supply chain issues inherent in a lot of cybersecurity threats.
So that's almost along the lines of the ransomware kind of discussion, right? Because anonymity has been, and the desire for organizations to have anonymity has really slowed down the sharing aspect. We have the information sharing and analytic centers in the United States that align across the 16 critical sectors of government established by Homeland Security. But even across those lines, the sharing is not where it needs to be. It would be great for us to be able to do that. And I still see, whether it's the United States or any other country, that the challenge is who is that trusted organization where people can disclose breaches and breach information, where they can have a sense of trust that they can have anonymity, that's not going to turn into a public relations nightmare for them. And I don't think as an international community we have a solution for that. It's similar to the GDPR, regulations that come out. I spent 25 years in Washington, so I'm Washington, D.C., so I'm no stranger to policy that comes out that fails to have operational relevance. And so those of us stuck trying to implement these regulatory requirements are the ones that seek the real challenges. Data sovereignty, extreme challenge, technically, if nothing else. You can screen scrape somebody's information on the other side of the world. Does that mean it's left the confines of their country? Of course it does. So how technically can you take on data sovereignty, those types of things? On the disclosure and information sharing, it still is trying to find a way that organizations can feel like they're protected, that type of breach information is going to be protected so that it doesn't become a brand degradation, a political nightmare or public relations nightmare for them. But still, we get the benefit of sharing that out, and customers are notified adequately that that provider has experienced a breach. Like a lot of the questions you're going to ask, we don't necessarily have the global answers for all of them. But I think as we start to, I love the engineering statement, a problem well stated is a problem half solved. So if we can start to state the problems and figure out the next logical steps to try to move in the right direction, I think it's a big step.
Simon.
Hello. I think as IT professionals, we have a habit of trying to solve problems technically rather than looking at business and at risk particularly. And the insurance industry has a big role to play here, I think. I was at a COSBAR conference, Council of Small Business, and someone asked the room, when was the last time anyone in the room suffered a physical security, so it was broken into? It's all small businesses. No one in the room had had it for 10 years. There were people in the room, a reasonable number, who had had cybersecurity incidents. Some had cybersecurity insurance, and what will happen as that becomes more widespread, as it becomes part of regular insurance, is the insurers are going to insist a certain level of cyber resilience and this type of stuff. And I think small businesses particularly have a role to play. We've seen with cloud and cloud accounting particularly that small businesses have taken it up quicker because their risk aversion is different, their ability to spend money is different, and the solutions are a little bit cheaper. Do you see that as a focus? And it was mentioned once before, but should it be something the ACS looks into as well in promoting cyber insurance?
I know Matt's ISACA has some pretty good strategy there to the point that you're making, that people are going to want assurances. And so I'm going to soft pitch that to Matt after I make this point. What we're seeing in the insurance company, in the insurance space in cybersecurity, is that insurance companies are using natural disaster models for cybersecurity. And that just doesn't work. But this is their foray into trying to figure out how they enter this market. What really needs to is the concept of cyber value at risk. CFOs for 20 years understand what value at risk is. Cyber value at risk says that I can assess the information assets that I've assigned certain risk to and valuated them to a certain amount of dollars. My controls, my mitigating controls are at 80%. With $1 million more, I could take them to 85, 90%. Drive down my premium in insurance, and so there's a direct correlation that cyber is a business enabler, that it actually drives the ability to conduct business. So the whole conversation, to your point, changes from a bits and bytes and a technical discussion to an absolute business discussion. And Matt?
And I'm just going to pile on the point that, because I think what's happening now is cyber policies are being written because boards of directors of enterprises are saying, well, how are we protecting the organization? And I think it's a bit of, there's a bit of, at least it's a US colloquial expression, but a bit of the wild, wild west out there with regard to that. One of the things that we've been looking at is the challenge of how does an enterprise actually measure its true capability in cyber? So by way of a quick story, and it's just one of many, but was with the CISO of a major financial company who explained to me that they walked into the boardroom and one of the directors asked, "Are we safe? You know, are we doing everything that we can to have our cyber capability as such where the organization is protected?" And the CISO told me that his response was, "Well, I think so." And of course, a very astute director says, "Well, what do you mean you think so?" And as we went into the conversation, what we learned is that there is no common model for assessing readiness of an enterprise. And this story we've heard repetitively over and over, and what we are planning on introducing in March of next year is something that we are presenting as the potential of an adoption of a universal consensus model for assessing cyber readiness capability across any enterprise. And the notion of that would be that you would go through a self-assessment of the enterprise that would not, it would be a risk-based model that looks at the cyber capability across the entire enterprise from a business perspective. So you're looking at people, process, technology, the whole gamut. And when you get to the end of the assessment, you will not only be able to get a sense of where you are on the continuum of the framework, but you will actually be able then to look at how others have assessed themselves, which then gives you something that you can bring into your boardroom and say, you know, here we are. And the background, the framework that's being used is I'm sure a number of you here are familiar with the capability maturity model that was developed at Carnegie Mellon University. ISACA acquired that back in March of 2016, and this was one of the areas where we saw a great opportunity to do something for the betterment of all enterprises. I'm giving you a very oversimplified view, but to tie it back to the insurance question is that if we were actually able to have enterprises look at this type of assessment of their readiness, it might also help to inform what actually, how insurance policies would actually be written, how they would be rated. It would bring a lot more rigor to the process of leveraging the value that insurance brings, to also connecting it to organizations who really want to improve and make sure that they have the appropriate risk mitigation strategies in place to prevent the nefarious activity from technology, and more importantly, looking at the positive side, that they're inspiring the confidence in the technology in which they're investing to deliver on business results.
Another question down the front.
My name is Afifi from Australian Sales Masters Training Company. 5 days ago, I read the news in ABC that there is a pacemaker hack being hacked. It's around 465,000 devices recalled and around 6,000 Australian with devices vulnerable to hacking. My question is, how government or organization related to this to address, or how we as a customer or consumer being like safe if there's something happen? What's the regulation or policy from the government to make sure that we are safe wearing something like in heart pacemaker or something else? Because this is 6,000 Australian wearing this pacemaker, but in US it's 465,000 they're being recalled.
Yeah. Thank you. So what is best practice in public policy to help protect us, our citizens?
Well, public policy, I think it's raising the awareness. And, let's just look at, for years, IC Squared has been advocating for secure software. Have we had success at that? Has the people spending the dollars to buy software stopped buying from people that deploy insecure code? No. And I can sense that you're moved by this. So am I mean, but the number of devices that are hackable, this is just what's being reported. This is that Internet of Things discussion that we get into where we have embedded systems and they have software, biometric, as you're talking about, public transportation. It's all over the place. That these devices, when they were manufactured, they didn't build security in because they didn't think of it in that context. It doesn't mean that these manufacturers are necessarily bad people. We just didn't have people that were going to go out and attack people's pacemakers, for heaven's sake. You know, we just didn't think the world would operate that way. And now, web and communications make all that possible for people that wish others ill. And so we've got to raise awareness with manufacturers that they've got to build security in at the design and engineering phase. We have to get cyber discussion into every aspect of engineering: mechanical, electrical, software engineering, chemical engineering, because they're all embedded in all of the products and services that we use every day for convenience, yet the bad actors use these for exploitation, for criminal activity, and life, limb, and property implications. So I hear exactly what you're saying. I think the right thing is that we've got to get manufacturers into the public policy makers. Public policy makers need to be sending a message to them that they're going to be held accountable. We haven't been able to do that with the software manufacturers, but I think this is a different thing. This is a device that somebody takes, and they should have some level of assurance that it's secure. And whether that means there's another lab, a lab that we would run these things through, that would come out and it would get a lab rating that it's passed at least some basic principles of security being built into it, that might be a good start. But it's a global problem. It's just not here in Australia. It's something. It's another one of those critical infrastructure, embedded systems, Internet of Things, Internet of Everything, or, you know, all these new names we're putting around embedded systems. But all these embedded systems have firmware and hardware and software running on them, and now they're highly exploitable, especially the legacy stuff that hasn't factored security in.
Jill, if I could...
I just wanted to add real quickly. I mean, number one, I was reading some background prior to coming to today's event, and the forecasts are here in Australia are that by 2019, the average individual will have 24 connected devices to the internet, right? So this is just an exclamation point on the points that David just made. You know, oftentimes in the notion of secure software design, one of the things that we hear, quote, not on the record, is that, well, I got to meet my delivery time because that's what's required for business results. Yeah. And of course, this always raises the question of, you know, is there ever a wrong time to do the right thing? These vulnerabilities are there, and we really need to step up the fact that security by design in both hardware and software is absolutely critical to addressing the issues of those of us walking around with multitudes of electronic devices connected to the internet. And last point on that is relative to workforce. You know, when we talk about cybersecurity workforce, there's a lot of ambiguity in the discussion because it's which part of the workforce are we talking about? Oftentimes there's a focus on who are the system specialists who are monitoring systems for attack. But we also need a strong workforce in the research areas coming out of the academic institutions, working in partnership with government and industry to really accelerate addressing these challenges because the technology moves faster than all of us.
Jill, I wanted to pick up on one of Alastair's points earlier, which was about the shoring up the supply pipeline of future talent. How do people make sense of formal university qualifications versus certifications?
My original training is as an engineer, and engineering is much more simple because our professional bodies have been much more structured. So we actually usually know where. I obviously did my engineering in England, but there will be a commonality between what we've all studied. So I think that what we ought to be doing in, I don't really like the term cybersecurity. Okay, I hate that term because it's all so all-encompassing. It's very unclear what a person has studied when they've studied cybersecurity. So I think to ensure the pipeline, what we ought to be doing is putting the fundamentals of people and process. And so we need to be teaching the technology plus all the organisational and social impacts of what we're doing, the business impacts of cybersecurity. So we need to put some of that formality into undergraduate degrees. Now, I would prefer to have a degree called Cybersecurity, but then on top of that, I would also put the certifications, because I think that's the best way, because the way that the academic system works is that we employ people for their ability to write journal articles and to publish. And very often, the people who are out there, we've been trained by these people too, actually don't have much experience with industry whatsoever. The industry experience, and especially from an Australian perspective, may have come from overseas. So they don't usually, a large majority, don't bring anything which is representative of the cybersecurity issues which you're finding in modern industry. So, but for the certifications from these two bodies, you actually need up to about 4 years of industry experience before you can actually get the full certification. You do have other ways, I know, of passing the exam, being associates of these. So my thought is to give the basics in an undergraduate degree, and then for somehow, with the support of government, to set up cadetships and graduate programs or internships which will give the industry exposure, and then direct people towards certification. So I was an engineer who was forced to look at things like business continuity, risk management and stuff which had never been in any of the formal academic qualifications that I took. I don't think there's enough room in the undergraduate curriculum of IT, business or engineering to put in all the components that you will find coming from either or both of these certification bodies. I wish there was, but we have very rigorous systems and I don't think we can put much more in there. My other belief is in developing graduate programs like master's degrees where you can actually subsume to build on top of a business or IT degree, so that you can subsume through arrangements with the certification bodies the actual knowledge which will then equip your student to go out and actually take the certification exam. So it's for university to sort of, through its own mechanisms, as it were, to sanitize the learning outcomes of the certifications and then give them back to you to actually take your certifications. Those would be my mechanisms for putting the two together. But I don't think you can have one. You can probably be self-taught and get the certification, but I don't think you can have just an undergraduate degree and be totally useful for industry. This is based on the last 15 years of trying to do this at several universities in Australia.
So I think the footnote, Jill, that I would add to what you said, though, is back to my previous point on, which part of the workforce in security are we talking about? Because, if we're talking about the system specialists on the front line and that's their career path, I think the nature of the learning modalities today afford opportunities for those who may not have pursued a college degree to still be a productive player in the space. And I say that the UK invested in an experiment earlier this year of training 55 individuals with technology aptitude that did not necessarily have the background of a college degree nor experience in the tech sector. And it included things like a barber, a bartender, and these individuals went through a 10-week training, and of the 55 that went through, 27 are now employed in those frontline roles. None of those individuals are likely to go down a path of wanting to move into management or whatever. But at a time when we need the workforce, if we look at the individual segments, because I think that's where the strength of your argument is, if we look at what are the fundamental requirements of each of the segments of the workforce, that's a very important play. Certainly, though, in the frontline specialist side, I mean, it is interesting that anyone with technology aptitude could theoretically be trained to perform that work, and we shouldn't preclude that type of retraining of our workforce or mining other parts as a vehicle to getting to the immediate solutions that we need.
if I just add, certification bodies, I think to Alastair's point earlier, one of the complaints, I get interviewed a lot and they'll say, well, one of the complaints are that you're creating barriers for entrance into the market. So let's just talk about that. I mean, the thumbnail is that it used to be certification or formal education. Those can clearly be complementary, that when you leave university that you go on to a professional certification that requires continual professional education. That's a completely complementary path. But to Matt's point, and I think Alastair's point, is that vocational, that aspect where we have people that are very bright that have learned on their own. We don't want to create a path that there's a barrier, that certification is a barrier, especially when we need so many entry-level positions. I mean, our research shows in roughly a 16,000 sample set that, out of that sample set, only 6% are below the age of 30. So we have a pipeline challenge around the world, and that follows a fairly consistent pattern in all the regions that we operate in. So what we have is our associate program that says if you pass the examination, if we require 5 years of experience, we give you 6 years to get that experience, and you hold an associate designation, and you move through getting that on-the-job training. So that's a complete career path for those entry-level positions, that they passed a rigorous examination, that they're having to do continual professional education and a lower level of CPE requirements because they're an associate. And once they get the experiential level, they'll hold a professional certification. So this is a way that you can start to build the pipeline of entry-level people. But we should not create barriers. It is too vitally critical that we hold up that formal education or a certification is more important than deploying people to, our vision as IC Squared is to inspire a safe and secure cyber world. So we try to inspire. I'm inspired when I meet up with Matt and we talk about what our organizations are doing. Inspiration can come from a lot of different places. And so we need to make sure we're inspiring all these folks. If they have an aptitude for it, if they're excited about a career path in cybersecurity, we should make a pathway for everyone that wants to make that, take that opportunity to come into the career path.
So we have a question down the front. While the microphone comes, I'll just ask another question of our panel. What have been the best experiences that you've observed, that you've been involved with, programs, initiatives? Matt touched on retraining. About organisations investing and building that capability of their frontline defenders.
The best experiences? I'm sorry. I mean, one of the exciting things that we're seeing is the recognition of some companies to actually build into the employees' time the opportunity for continuing professional education. And because I think amidst what we were just talking about relative to credentialing, I mean, along with credentialing puts a real spotlight on the need to maintain sharp skills. And the changes in the technology, the changes in the threat landscape really make this paramount importance. And the organizations that we're seeing, that I have been seeing that are excelling in this area are carving out the necessary time for their teams to gain a better understanding of what the changes are that are occurring on sometimes a daily basis. One of the positions that ISACA has taken is that we do believe that when it comes to cybersecurity, especially in the frontline systems monitoring, one of the best methods for training is to do it in a hands-on environment. And in that regard, I love to use the analogy of how airline pilots are trained, because airline pilots are trained to fly, they get a certain number of hours and they go up, but there is a commitment to retraining in a simulator, and part of that environment is to enable them to experience situations that might occur that would be unfamiliar to them, from which they can actually draw on their learnings to try to further their skills and capabilities in the name of safety. I think there's a lot of parallels here in the cybersecurity arena. We were talking last night that ISACA has created a training platform that is providing that type of experience, and one of the things that we talked about is that just because you do something doesn't necessarily reflect that you've actually learned it. What creates that learning environment is the ability that you can actually be faced with a situation where there could be multiple solutions, and then you can actually work towards getting those solutions as opposed to something that's defined for you. And I think the organizations that are embracing this, and I can say this from the fact that we have enterprises that are adopting the platform that we've created, is that they're building this into the way in which their employees are training. And I think there's a question of whether or not something like this, whether it's our platform or someone else's, we hear about development of cyber ranges and cyber experiences, is how we can improve that kind of firsthand training, because just saying, I can deal with a simple breach doesn't make the grade when you consider the fact that tomorrow you might see a new attack that you've had no background or no idea, and the question is, what are you going to do to mitigate that when you see it?
Jill?
I think I can just answer it this way. I'm encouraged by what Alastair was pointing to, was just the real willingness to collaborate in Australia. In the last few years, I've been working with a lot of different government departments and people in Defence Force, and a real move from having to do a job from compliance to passion. Because I think if you listen to those of us who are deeply into this, you have to be driven by a passion, and that passion is usually a passion to defend and protect, to understand the role that we play within national and international security. I'm only motivated by that, and I've often found I feel like my passion drains out of me because I'm not always mixing with passionate people, but there are more and more passionate people. And there's those who understand both the business, the tension between the business implications and actually also the national security implications. And I see a new generation wanting to do that, and some of them are self-taught, some of them are in uniform, some of them used to be in uniform, and some of them are just even kids in schools, but there's passion. And that is very encouraging, and I think it's our job to sort of harness that, to recognise skills so that we, if you want to talk about a pipeline, so we help push all those people in the pipeline to do the jobs which are essential for security.
David?
Yeah, I don't disagree with Matt on the learning side of it and what Jill has said. I would say that, I think organizations that are going to be successful, I just want to talk about briefly the generational aspect. The Millennial Generation represents the largest, most diverse generation of our time, and they think very differently. When they say they're going to work, they don't think of work as a brick and mortar place. They think of it as a coffee shop or any place they can open up their device. They look for things like organizations that won't pigeonhole them into one aspect of how they work. They look for mentorship, which tells us we're completely out of sync, because mentorship is almost a lost art. I don't know what your experience is, but who has time? And if you're doing mentoring, thank you so much. I mean, people that take time to mentor, boy, we need more of that. But we have an entire generation that makes up the next wave that has a completely different way that they look about how they work, the way they want to work, and the organizations they want to work for. And so if we're going to be successful, and I'll just add another thing. Around the world, in 1995, APAC region outpaced the United States in putting out STEM candidates into the workforce, and they've never looked back. But when we look around the world and we look in the United States, we have a very difficult time in getting new individuals coming into this career path. The same numbers are almost exactly the same in APAC, so it's not a STEM issue. The United States has a STEM problem, but that's a separate problem. But we have STEM candidates here in the APAC region, yet we're still not attracting them into the profession. So what is that? It's a messaging problem. It's somehow we are not getting the message out to the next generation that needs to be coming into the workforce. And we got to figure that out. I don't know that Matt has the secret to it or I have the secret or we'd already be doing it, but we can see it statistically that you have a plethora of engineering type, STEM type of candidates in this region, yet in this region we still see the numbers almost at the same level we see in the United States and other regions. So that doesn't tell me that we don't have engineering types that can come into the profession. We're not attracting them in for some reason. And there are all kinds of theories that we're working on to do that. So I would say organizations need to look at the audience that they're trying to attract into the profession, how they think different generationally what their educational background is and create paths to bring them in to help us fill this dearth of talent. And we can talk about how big the number is. The number is just big. We might say 1.8, Cisco might say 2.5. Let's just say that we have a dearth of talent. We have to figure out how we fill that talent with the next wave of cybersecurity professionals.
Now, we may have time for 2 more roving mic questions. If we keep responses to 30 seconds, please.
Thank you. Patrick Kelso from Deloitte. I want to circle back to the beginning. I've been holding this microphone a while, so I'm going to come back to the ethics and trust question. And anyone who didn't read in the AFR yesterday an article about Ian Silk, the CEO of Australian Super, I highly recommend it. His comment was, we spent months coming up with our organisational ethic policy and our principles, and then I realised they were exactly the same as Enron. And I work for Deloitte, so a bit closer to home for me. They were exactly the same as Arthur Andersen, who were the auditors. These companies were members of professional bodies, they had ethics, they had compliance requirements, but they weren't obviously holding to them. So what role does the government take, and please do not answer with the sentence, it moves too fast for government. What role does government take in regulating and forcing these companies to act in a way that is responsible for the community at large?
Good question.
Wow.
Maybe a little bit longer.
A stronger role than they have demonstrated. That's it.
You're here.
I don't have any answer for that because it's out of context for me.
I think I don't have any silver bullets when it comes to this, and I do think that there needs to be a stronger role, I mean, I think it really leads also to just how is our culture going to evolve. I mean, by academic background, I'm in sociology, and I really am interested in how cultural change around the fact that technology permeates everything we do now. And so, technology, I mean, at SACA, our purpose is to help you realize the positive potential of technology. But we know that when you try to realize the positive potential, you also have to mitigate the risk of the nefarious. And, in that regard, it's everybody's business to try to figure out how we create the necessary awareness and self-policing of our society. And government has to play a stronger role in helping facilitate that message.
I mean, I would just say it's a paradox, right? We want stronger government regulation, but the regulation arms can't get to the permutations of regulating. They would need armies and armies of people to be looking over shoulders to do it. The other side of that is the laissez-faire mentality is that let's create a culture where the industry is self-regulating, self-policing. We've accomplished that to a degree with IC2 because our members will report other members that they think are doing things that are not correct. But it's a challenging situation, and I can sense your frustration with it. But I would just say one thing that organizations, SACA and IC2 do, at least until countries get their strategy together, is that we have an international membership, and our members subscribe to that code of ethics, and we try to monitor, and we try to get the bad folks out of our membership. And at least that's something until, by a country basis, that there's a better thing there. It is something. It's better than nothing at all. And we're constantly looking for ways to improve it.
Final question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ajay from Coca-Cola Amatil. And
Uh-oh.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to go 2 questions, and these are the final 2.
first.
Please first and then second.
I'm Ajay from Coca-Cola Amatil, and I'm also a student of Masters in Cybersecurity with Macquarie University. One fundamental question which we are not answering at the moment is attribution and prosecution. Historically, if you see, it is attribution and the fear of prosecution which deters the cyber criminals or criminals in any area. So what are the governments, regulators, and international bodies doing about attribution and prosecution when it comes to cybercrime and cyber terrorism?
So you're talking about bringing the law to bear on the bad actors that are out there committing these crimes. I just want to make sure
I mean, that may be one form of deterrence. We may invest in technologies, but fundamentally it is a deterrence. It's a fear of prosecution that stops a person. I would if I could, most of the things, but something that stops me is the fear of law, fear of being prosecuted.
Well, when you start to take that, I think law in cyber, even within a country, is years behind what's happening in cybersecurity. Now you take that and you spread that over international law and international barriers of law. That's where the criminals hide from. And so, you know, they'll pivot from another country or servers here to make it look like attribution is there. It's extremely, extremely challenging. I don't have an answer for you, sir. I wish I did, because if I did, I'd be trying to put together some cogent argument that we would take forward to at least where we have members working in those countries of how we might get our arms around that. I think it has to start at least country by country. And if country cooperation is that we believe that there's a bad actor that has wronged someone in this country, that we can have trust that those law enforcement entities will go after and pursue and prosecute those individuals. But I still think we're years away from seeing that be effectively applied consistently.
And final question, if I can.
I'll keep it very brief. There's been a lot of very good discussion about skill development and the importance of technical skill in particular. But as many of us would know, social engineering is probably the most effective way to break into a network and so forth. So has there been any consideration of how you might build in skills of communicating with the business, driving behavior change into the skill development discussion?
I can answer that on behalf of the University of Western Sydney, who I love what they've done, because they put together an undergraduate degree which is in cybersecurity and behaviour, which is psychology. So I think that what has happened in most countries, but particularly here, and you hear us speaking in this sense that from a discipline point of view, we all live in little buckets. So we live in the computer science one or the engineering one. And as researchers, we've been forced to because of funding mechanisms. But what we need to do is break down all those walls to create cross-disciplinary degrees from bottom up. University of Western Sydney have been brave enough to do this. And I have tried a couple of unis where I've worked to do that and was never allowed, because your people need to live in one discipline. From an accreditation point of view, this would affect the ACS as well, because there has to be a certain amount of computing in a computing degree, but nevertheless, what you're touching on is incredibly important. And some university, and I'm looking at Michael over there, should put together the master's degree, which puts together the behavioural issues with the at least a medium-sized technical understanding of the risk, the technological risk, because I think there's a huge market for people like that. There's a need in Australia.
Thank you. Unfortunately, David, we're running out of time. Our live stream broadcast must end. Amy, can I ask you to come forward just for a little gift for Alastair? And Jess, you've got gifts for our panellists. Can we please thank Alastair, David, Matt and Jill? So we're really cognizant of making sure we could provide time for everyone to get back to the office. Just want to do a short commercial. As Anthony alluded to, announcement tomorrow on ACS professional benchmarks in cybersecurity. And then in terms of events, back here on the 28th with the Federal Treasurer, Scott Morrison, looking at the digital economy for ACS members. If you are able to join, please jump on the website and register. Thanks for joining us this morning.